You seek the key, but first you must learn the ways of precision, craft, and performance with Acura's all-electric ZDX. With a premium Bang & Olufsen sound system, up to a 313-mile range, and a Type S variant with an estimated 500 horsepower, the ZDX is their most powerful SUV yet. Unlock the energy when you visit Acura.com to order yours today. Okay, let's do some quick math. The less your business spends on operations, on multiple systems, on delivering your product or service, the more margin you have and the more money you keep. That's obvious. But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more. To reduce costs and headaches, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. Here's the thing. Information is power. Information is money. Literally, the currency of today's world of entrepreneurship is information. And if you could bring all of the information about your business into one dashboard, this is incredibly valuable. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one platform and one source of the truth about your business. With NetSuite, you reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, access from anywhere. You cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite. And you're improving efficiency by bringing all of your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. This is so valuable. You just hit a button and you can see all the information about your business instead of having to call 5 different departments and get all these emails and put it all together and make sense of it. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move. So do the math, see how you'll profit with NetSuite. Backed by popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/James. 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 It is so important in life to learn how to be a good interviewer. Not because you're a reporter, not because you're a podcaster, but so many situations in life are quasi interviews, like when you're applying for a job, or when you are hiring somebody, or when you meet a girl or a guy at a party. You want to find out as much about them as quickly as possible. And you also want to make sure they have a good opinion of you if that's your goal. So being a good interviewer and having those skills is critical. And I'm so grateful that I've had this podcast and I've had to study the styles of some of the best interviewers out there. But one of the best interviewers out there has recently written an article, How to Be a Great Interviewer. And I'm talking about Polina Pompliano, who writes the newsletter, The Profile. She does profiles of so many amazing people. I highly recommend Google Polina Pompliano. She's written a book, Hidden Genius, but subscribe to her newsletter, The Profile. And she just had an edition where she didn't profile someone, but she wrote about the 10 best techniques for being a great interviewer. And she studies the greats, distills what their top 10 techniques are. I really got a lot of value out of this, so asked her to come on the podcast, and we just shared stories about how to be a good interviewer. So let me know if this was valuable to you, but I'm sure it will be. Here's Polina, and we talk about how to be a great interviewer.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
You've done so many interviews through your newsletter. Is the newsletter, is it actually called The Profile?
It is called The Profile, yes.
Okay. And I always forget the title, but it is the one newsletter. When I get it, that's like the first newsletter I open. I just love your profiles. You're profiling everybody from billionaires to artists, And it's great because unlike a podcast, you don't feel obligated to bring the person in to your house and interview them. You just profile anybody you're interested in. You do extra, it allows you to do extra research and so on.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of times I back my way into interviewing them. So if I really want to interview someone and I don't think I can yet, I put together like a deep dive on them and then I send it to them or their people. And I'm like, hey, look, this is my style. This is what I do. I'd love to interview you. And I've gotten a few interviews that way.
Yeah, and you've now built up such a following that I imagine, like book publishers or movie studios should be pitching you, "Hey, can you profile our author or actor or whatever?"
Yeah. No, I get quite a few. Only a few of them are actually really, really interesting, but I read every email.
Believe me, we get I would say realistically we get about between 10 and 20 a day.
I believe it.
And sometimes I get angry, actually. Not really like angry, but I want to write back and said, "Why do you think this person
Yeah.
I would want to not that like everybody is valuable and everybody has an interesting story, but like given
Yes.
for a podcast, you have a certain brand or you have a certain type of person. You could tell the person did no research. Like, why would I want to
Right.
interview somebody who I don't know? I don't want to put anybody down, but and it's not like I think I'm so elite, but
No, it's the point of view of the podcast. It's like they should
right.
know who they're pitching. I completely agree.
And but you do a lot of interviews though, like for your newsletter, and like me, you study the art of the interview, which is why I love that article you wrote where you took a break from profiling and you did 10 interview techniques from the world's best interviewers, and it's really like something that I am obsessed by. Like you've taken a slightly different angle in your research, and
Yeah.
everybody has their own style, and like I've looked at everybody from like Larry King to Oprah to Howard Stern to Joe Rogan. Like everybody's got their own style, and it's very interesting to study people's interviewing styles because an interviewer has to, you know, unwrap this gift. And there's a lot of wrapping around the gift, but if you get to the gift
Yeah.
itself, you get a beautiful interview.
It's so true. And the reason, I mean, I think everyone who interviews people for a living, as you do, I'm sure has done this research for themselves, which is what I was doing. I was just compiling thoughts for myself to get better. And then I was like, maybe I should just like publish this because everybody's always trying to be a better conversationalist, interviewer. Even if you have nothing, if you don't have a podcast or an interview show, you're probably interviewing candidates for a job at your business. So it's like something everybody can benefit from.
It's so true. Like I have found that getting good at interviewing, and I'm not saying I'm great. It's like a nonstop. It's like a lifelong study. To
Yes.
you have to master it, like mastering a sport or mastering music. Interviewing is it you're playing an instrument, which is the person you're interviewing, and that's a little maybe not quite good, but you have to kind of it's a path to mastery and it's difficult,
Exactly.
but it does improve other areas of my life. Like it helps me relate to people in general and understand people and so on. Like when you're
Hmm.
interviewing, what is your goal feeling that you want the interviewee, the person you're interviewing, to have by the end of the interview?
My goal going into any interview is to make them think. I think so, especially, when you interview a lot of CEOs and founders and people like that, oftentimes they're very media trained and it's really hard to break that veil or that like
Yes.
pierce that smoke screen. And my goal is like, I want to have them pause after a question, be like, hold on, I've never actually thought of that or thought about it that way. And when you make them think, it's like it humanizes them just a little bit. The problem is that it takes a while to get through that. And when I was writing this, article about the interviewing techniques, I was like, how can you do that more quickly? Like, how can you build intimacy quicker so that you get there faster?
Right, because let's say you only have a half hour to an hour
Yeah,
to interview them, which really means you only have about 5 minutes, maybe even less, to make them feel comfortable with who you are as an interviewer. Because a lot of people might be on guard. And like you said, a lot of people, particularly like CEOs or other high profile people,
Yep.
they have their media message that like one time, I'll give you an example. Like one
Yeah.
time I was interviewing Tony Robbins after one of his books came out, and he had such a message, and he's such a big, monstrous guy.
Domineering. Yeah.
Yeah. And I say this in the best possible way, that he just gets on his spiel, and I had to practically yell at him to interrupt. And you discuss the art of interruption in your article. We'll get to the specific techniques. And other times people don't know that when they're saying something that might be interesting, they're just kind of listing some things that have happened in their life. And they're, oh, I got over a cocaine addiction. And then I did this.
Yeah.
Wait a second. How did you get the addiction?
Yes.
You're never going to, and people are afraid to interrupt, but you're never going to get this chance again to talk to them.
100%. And it's so good, especially like you said, Tony Robbins probably doing like 100 interviews for his book. He's on message. Even if you ask him a question, he'll probably just answer something kind of related, but not really, to get his message across. And it's like the interviewers, you are definitely one of them who are actually listening. They are the ones who like rewind the tape, like, wait, let's focus on that a little bit more. And I think for me, to go back to like, if you have 30 minutes, how do you get to that intimacy quicker? What I do is often, if I'm asking them to share something a little more vulnerable, I'll start first. Howard Stern does this a lot. It's like you share something about your own life or your own struggle or whatever, and that allows them to be like, oh, okay, like, let me tell you my experience. It's a little like, I'll give a little, you give a little, and I think that helps.
That is so interesting, because that's where your interviews are different from a podcast, because
Yeah.
I can't do that so much. I've done 1,500 episodes, and I can't do that so much in a podcast because my listeners, they know my story. It would
Right.
be very hard to reveal something new to my regular listeners. So I see where you're saying with the vulnerability, and sometimes I try to do that because that's a really important thing to get out of them. But I have to kind of work around that a little bit sometimes, maybe before the interview, or or maybe what I have to do is really show them how much I appreciate what they've been through.
Yes, exactly. And the pre-interview, like the time before the interview actually starts, is also very important because you can build that rapport before you even start.
Yeah, and so you want them to think, it's interesting. I haven't thought of it that way. What I want them to say to me afterwards is, man, that felt like a therapy session.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then what do you want your reader or listener to think after you've done an interview?
I want them to be like, wow, I actually really learned something from this person, or there's one piece of practical something that I can take away and implement in my life. I always try to like extract something practical from the person, because ultimately, if you're a listener of a podcast, you probably want to get better, you probably want to grow. So it's like, what is one technique that like maybe I haven't considered, or maybe I haven't thought about in that way, that I can implement in my day?
And do you ever get nervous or
Oh,
intimidated before you interview someone?
all the time, every
I
time.
I still do.
Really?
Yeah.
After 1,500?
I mean, I'll tell you, I first professionally was interviewing people, and my listeners know this story, but I worked
Yeah.
for HBO in the 90s, and I did this project where I was interviewing people at 3 in the morning in New York City. So
Wow.
prostitutes, pimps, drug dealers,
Yeah.
other homeless, whatever. And I would just walk up to people at 3 in the morning. So you have to, there's a degree of comfort. You have to make them
Oh
feel
my
very
gosh,
quickly, and they might have weapons. So, so I've done a lot of interviews. I did thousands of those, and I was always nervous walking up to somebody, but I'm still, if someone's coming on, I'm like, almost always the 30 seconds before the interview starts, I hope they cancel. Like that's
I
how
have
nervous
that
I get.
feeling a lot too. It's so interesting, right? Like I think that being nervous is actually a good sign, because you prepare.
Yeah.
The people who are like, whatever, and they don't end up preparing, and then it's not as good of an interview. I think like that nervousness is what keeps you really good.
I think so. Do you ever do an interview though, and you feel like, man, I could have done better?
Oh, yeah,
at that.
totally.
Like
And
that feels
then
really bad.
and then somehow that happened to me recently. I was like, "Oh, no, that fell short." And then it ended up like the listeners really liked it. It's just like, "How does this happen?" You know? Sometimes your bar of quality is different.
That's true. But like, okay, a couple years ago, I interviewed, before he was running for president, I interviewed RFK Jr.
Okay.
And I read his book. I read other, but that was a mistake because when you read his book, I mean, I'm glad I read his
Yeah.
book and I did other research, but I didn't really, of course, you only get his side of the story on that stuff.
Right.
I didn't really realize the depth to which, drug problems and other factors were, formed his view of life. And I feel like I should have asked more about that, but I just wasn't as aware as I should have been.
It's hard. It's also hard. One-on-one interviews I find really difficult because you don't have the benefit of like going. I mean, I guess you could do that, but it just takes a lot of work. You could go, for example, if you're writing a profile in a magazine, you would go interview his associates, people he's worked
Right.
with, family members, friends, whatever. But like this, you truly are only getting this one person's side of the story. You can't bring in different voices.
Right. And I don't, like a podcaster is not a journalist. I don't consider you a
Right.
journalist. You're writing something not to say, oh, I got the dirt on this person,
Right.
or I found out, this thing they did, it's a story, but you're trying to help your readers and
Yes.
find lessons and benefits. And okay, journalism has its role, but I think for me it's more interesting like your style of profile than reading an I got
Thank
you
you,
kind of
James.
story. So
Yeah.
cuz then you don't, like, I find when everybody, with a lot of journalism, the journalist has an agenda that maybe is not a friendly agenda, and they're trying to get, they're trying to get some achievement in their career, which might go against the goals of their
Yeah.
readers and the goal of the person they're interviewing.
I really truly get upset when I see something like that. There is a place for hard hitting, investigative journalism, and I will defend that to the death. What I don't like is somebody coming in being like, "Oh, this is a cheap shot. I'm just gonna get my, sound bite and move on." And I mean, I don't want to like harp on it, but in the article that I wrote in parentheses, so it's not like that obvious, but I included a link to what happens when a reporter has an agenda, he's not well prepared, and he's trying to take somebody down. With Elon Musk, this reporter came in and he was just like, "Well, what do you think about this?" And he was like, he was talking about Twitter and after Elon acquired it and all this stuff. And Elon was like, "Well, give me an example of what you're talking about." And he was like, well, I don't really use Twitter." It's just like, oh my gosh, it's so bad, but it just shows the lack of preparation. And then Elon's able to turn it around on him. It's just super embarrassing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too, by the way, is that when you're being interviewed by someone who's doing that I got you style, and
Yeah.
they're never going to really be fully prepared because they have an agenda. So you have to fit in their
Right.
agenda. And there are a lot of great techniques for dealing with that also. And this works like it just in general in any kind of argument.
Mm.
Often they slightly change the subject. So instead of saying
Huh.
like, "Hey, this is how you bought Twitter," they might make it kind of their own opinion about freedom of speech. And then I don't know that particular interview you're referring to, but
Yeah.
Elon Musk might be able to say, "Hey, did you just change the subject? I'm happy to talk about that, but let me know. Is that what we're talking about now?
Mm,
Or are we still talking about Twitter?" And so
that's a
there's
good
ways to
point.
kind of, like, you could label what they're doing, and then that sort of throws them off a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. And it just, yeah. I think that some people um, get power drunk and they don't think that the subject will push back. And when they do, they kind of lose their footing and just chaos ensues.
Yeah. And look, the great thing about newsletters and podcasts is these are the sorts of things that did not exist 20 years ago.
Wow.
The technology wasn't there, the audio wasn't there. So you had to be chosen by like the New York Times or
Hmm.
a powerful radio station or the Washington Post. And so you felt like you had status. So it was a different type of feeling that reporters and journalists had then, whereas we sort of
Yes.
have created our media And it's like you have your own magazine, I have my own radio show, but we chose ourselves to do that, so we don't have to do the I got you kind of journalism. We could be the bridge between our audience and really intelligent, smart,
Yeah.
inspirational people, and that's a value.
And I just want to like add a little nuance here. It's not that we're saying never challenge the person. That's not at all what this is. It's like I got you versus challenging. I think actually you do this really well. And I remember when I came on your show for my book, in the beginning, you said something like, okay, but hold on. I want to challenge this point of view that you had in the book because I think it's contradictory to something else that you said. That was so good because it allowed me to explain it in more detail. And I knew that you don't just like take people's crap. Like you're not like, well, you said it, so it must be fact. Like, no, let's explore that. And I'm going to challenge you. But in challenging you, I'm actually giving you an opportunity to explain yourself better.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think there's a couple things there. One is it shows, and then I really do want to get to your techniques.
Yeah. Sorry.
But when I do something like that, it's because I'm really curious why, or maybe there's something I didn't understand. Like I am trusting you, so I'm trying to figure out what didn't I understand. And then B, like you said, it allows to get more information out and to dig a little further. But also C, there's a slight part where I'm showing you how deeply I read your book. It's a way of showing respect to you. So then you become more comfortable in the interview, or whoever I'm interviewing becomes more comfortable. So many interviewers don't read their latest books or the things they're trying to promote. So then what's the point? And I always want to make sure, not only do I prepare questions, but I prepare how am I going to demonstrate that I have studied them more than anyone else.
Exactly.
So it's a little selfish.
And it reflects in your questions, and it shows that you're genuinely curious, which is one of the things, a cornerstone of an interviewing technique.
Take a quick break. If you like this episode, I'd really, really appreciate it. It means so much to me. Please share it with your friends and subscribe to the podcast. Email me at altucher@gmail.com and tell me why you subscribed. Thanks. Yes, it's totally true. Airbnb has changed my life. If anything, they have made my life so much better. Like, I used to live in Airbnbs. I lived in over 100 or 200 different Airbnbs over a 3-year period, and I loved it. I became a really good guest of Airbnbs, and I got to know lots of hosts. So when I initially owned a house, of course, the first thing I thought was, I'm going to turn my house into an Airbnb because I travel a lot. So why leave my house unused when I can make a side income by letting others Airbnb my house or come to stay in my house as guests? And having my own Airbnb or being a host for Airbnb has allowed me to do just that. And I've met other hosts. I've actually spoken at Airbnb's host conference. I think it was in 2017. I met so many just nice hosts. It's a great community. And I love, turning my own home into an Airbnb. Like, I'm traveling to Austin next month. My home's going to be an Airbnb while I'm away, and I'll stay in an Airbnb. I'd rather stay in like a 3-story house Airbnb than in one tiny hotel room in the middle of Austin during South by Southwest. So listen, while you're away, your home could be an Airbnb. Many people host on Airbnb, but there are people who are just letting their house sit empty, who've never thought about it or didn't realize their space could be an Airbnb. Hosting can easily fit into your lifestyle and is a great way to earn some extra money. So if you have a home, but you're not always at home, then you have an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host. I remember last year I was asked to go speak at the Norway Business Summit, and I was so excited because side by side with the Business Summit was the Norway Chess Summit, where I would get to see in person Magnus Carlsen, the best chess player ever, playing chess. But it was 4 plane rides, like, to get to the city that ultimately I would go to. So I really did not want to fly for 14 hours, and they were willing to pay for everything for me. So I at first class. So I didn't want to fly for 14 hours and not be first class. So I had to hurry up and get on the phone immediately to get those first class tickets to a chess tournament in Norway. And listen, this is just like when, you have to know when you want the best of anything, you have to act quickly or someone else will get it instead. And I did not want those seats to fill up. So it's like if you're hiring for your business, you want to find the most talented people for your open roles before the competition scoops them up. I just was talking to a friend this morning where he was trying to decide between some programmers and he waited a little too long, and both the programmers he was interviewing took other jobs, like great jobs. So, what's the best way then to hire the best as quickly as possible? ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter finds qualified candidates fast. And right now you could try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/James. Just try it and see. You'll find out. So ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology takes center stage to identify the top talent for your roles. Immediately after you post your job, ZipRecruiter's smart technology starts showing you qualified people for it. And I know this because one time I signed up as an potential employee on ZipRecruiter, and I got nonstop. Really, even though obviously I wasn't looking for a job, I love what I do, but I just wanted to see what would happen because they were a sponsor of my podcast. And the most interesting jobs would pop up in my emails like, hey, you're qualified for this or that. And so it's interesting to see. So just go there and try it. Try ZipRecruiter.com/James. Amp up your hiring performance. Now, this is more for if you're hiring, but amp up your hiring performance with ZipRecruiter and find the best fast. See why 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. Just go to this exclusive web address right now to try ZipRecruiter for free. ZipRecruiter.com/James. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/James. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Let's see your techniques, because you've studied so many of these great interviewers. So the first thing you say is they know the first question. This is so important. A great interviewer knows the first question sets the tone for the entire interview. And you give an example. You give 2 examples with Zuckerberg. Tim Ferriss, who's a great podcaster, his first question was about fencing. And Zuckerberg, who's constantly being challenged in the media, he just opened up and relaxed, and like they're friends, which is what you want as an interviewer, as a goal, like become instant friends. Whereas somebody else interviewed Zuckerberg or Kara Swisher and was like, tell me, why are you anti-privacy or whatever she said?
Take off your hoodie, you're sweating through it. Like it's just a dressing down of literally and figuratively.
So like, I wonder if that was her goal, was just to kind of show her readers that she could be tough, or if she really thought that would be a good interviewing technique to kind of throw them off real quickly.
Well, I mean, that's kind of her thing, but also I think it's 2 different contexts. Tim Ferriss was interviewing him on a podcast, so they had 2 hours. She was interviewing Zuckerberg on stage, and maybe they had 30 minutes, 15 minutes. So they have to get there faster. She has to ask those questions faster. The problem is that you risk burning the subject that you're trying to interview. Mark Zuckerberg, after that interview with Kara Swisher, did not do an interview with her for 8 years. In that period of time, Facebook became Facebook. So, I mean, you risk that. But also, when you go straight into the meat, the person's on the defensive, like they're on guard. They're not going to be as open. Whereas when Tim Ferriss starts like that with fencing, it opens up Zuckerberg. And naturally, as a human being, if Tim Ferriss brings up a difficult subject later in the interview, it's just you've built that rapport, so it's easier to ask and respond to the hard questions.
Yeah, but I wonder, let's say you were Kara Swisher in that case.
Yeah.
What would you have? Let's say you only have 30 minutes. I don't know how much time she had. Let's say you only had 30 minutes and you wanted to but you being Polina, you wanted
Yeah.
to start with an interview that is more warm and friendly, the way Tim Ferriss did. Like, what would you have done?
I think just the first question wouldn't have been a direct, what are you doing about privacy? Maybe I would have started with an anecdote of someone using the platform and, like something adjacent to the privacy question. And then I would have gotten there. It's just the first three questions of her and her colleagues when they were interviewing Zuckerberg were about privacy. Like, maybe let's just open it up with something that like is a little sets the tone that this is what we're going to talk about, but it's softer, and then go into the more direct.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, I think what I would have done, like you said, fencing might be too long
That's
of a
too far.
subject.
Yeah.
But I might have said something like, I just want to mention in 2006, the first time I turned on Facebook,
Exactly.
it was the
Something
most
like that.
amazing experience for me. I could finally see what my friends from first grade are doing now. I would never call them, but I could
Yeah.
see how their kid's soccer game did last night. Like,
Here's how I would do it. Sorry to
that's
interrupt
it.
you.
Yeah.
I would, for example, I would say, Mark, like Facebook is amazing for somebody like me because I get to, for the first time, you guys, your company gave me the opportunity to connect with family in Bulgaria, where previously I had no contact with, like we couldn't share photos like this as easily, whatever. And then I would say, by the way, I noticed that my grandmother in Bulgaria is posting links to things that's definitely misinformation and it's kind of propaganda. How are you guys handling that with my grandmother in Bulgaria? Something like that where it's not as abrasive.
Right. Like, that's really good. Because then you could say, like, does she need to be worried because the government in
Right.
Bulgaria? And then and then you could always bring that in. What about people here in the US? Is it different? Is it the same? Like, why are people worried about privacy here?
Exactly.
Yeah, that would have been good. And all of this stuff is important too for a job. Like, let's say you're just going for a job at some random bank. So it's like sort of generic. It's very important to research and figure out how to connect. Like, why this bank? Why this person? Why are you sitting there? Like, what's happening that's beyond just money and doing work that connects you to this experience? I think it's important to always think of these interview questions.
Exactly. When I was interviewing at Fortune, I go in to interview for a job, but if I hadn't researched the person who was interviewing me, I would have never known that she got her PhD at the same university where I graduated from. That's a huge, like, connective, thing that we could talk about. But if I hadn't done my research on her, I wouldn't have known that. And it would have just been like any generic interview she'd done that day.
I'll tell you, like, that is incredibly valuable. That's the most valuable thing that's going to come out of this particular podcast, because
Tell me.
just that type of thing, when you research the people in advance that you're going to talk to in a job situation or some professional business situation. Of course, it's obvious that we do this in interviews, or we should, but not everybody does that for a job interview or the first time you meet somebody in a professional setting. Like, I've had companies actually acquired from me because I've done that level of research. Like, one time I met the CFO of a company that was acquiring my company at the time.
Yeah.
And I learned that he went to Grinnell College, and it was we were both I had a finance company that I was selling.
Yeah.
I said, Grinnell College, of course. And there was the CFO and the CEO in the room. I explained to the CEO, you got to really know that Grinnell College is an important case study because they have the fastest growing endowment, because a young man by the name of Warren Buffett is sitting on their board of trustees.
Wow.
And so that ingratiated the CFO to me.
Exactly.
The CEO learned something. was able to show everybody I knew what I was doing. So It's stuff like that is really valuable.
It's small, but it's like we're human beings. It makes you more likable to me,
Yeah, and again, like, no matter what an interview, the interviewee is nervous also. They want to be at ease. You only have an hour together. You want to be able to maybe interview them later. Like you said, Mark Zuckerberg didn't go back to Kara Swisher for 8 years. I'm surprised he went back at all. But I guess that's his job too, to be the face of his company. But it's important. So, you got to set the tone. Number 2, By the way, you start mentioning Larry King. And
Yes.
Larry King is an excellent person to study because he specifically, and you mentioned he's conducted 60,000
That's
interviews.
crazy.
Yeah. And he did not research on purpose the people he would interview because he wanted it to be fresh. Like the listener might not know who.
But he really listened while the interview was going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what do you think of that approach of not doing any research at all?
I think it works for some people. It would not work for me. I think I would be too nervous that I didn't touch on something that I should have touched on. And also I would be nervous that I'm just asking the same questions they've already been asked 10 billion times. But like the experts, the masters of their craft, you know, they know what they're doing, and it works for some people, but you just got to know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it would work for me either. But
Yeah.
sometimes when you do too much research, I have
Yeah.
to make sure the listener knows what I'm talking
The
about.
context, yeah.
So sometimes it's a fine line to navigate, but I agree. I have to do the research. I'm impressed with Larry King, but there are some funny stories because Larry King does it this way. Like he famously asked Jerry Seinfeld in an interview, you know, how did you feel when your show was canceled? And Jerry Seinfeld was like, Larry, do you know who I am?
Yeah, exactly. But like that makes for a great television.
Yeah, it's true. Your second one's really interesting. Your second point is a good interviewer explores the gap between expectation and reality. So, like, give me an example.
Yeah. So, okay, I learned this from Brandon Stanton, who's the photographer behind Humans of New York. He interviews regular people on a daily basis, and he often has like 10 or 15 minutes with them. It's not, 2 hours. So he's like, how do you build intimacy quickly? One of the questions that he asks is, how has your life turned out differently than you expected it to? And the reason that's such a powerful question is because it introduces conflict, like internal turmoil in the subject. They're like, oh man, like I really thought my life would be this way, but then I got this drug addiction and now it's this way. And you see how like, it's almost like the life unlived, all the different possibilities of the way your life could have turned out and the way it actually did. So it forces the subject to kind of consider two realities and build a connection between them and be like, this is the reason why my life did not turn out this way.
Yeah, that is really good. You know, I've never tried that question. I should. That's a really good way to get fast intimacy. And
And
you
it,
mentioned Ira Glass also in that.
he does he does the same thing. He says, how did you think the situation was going to work out before it happened, and then how did it really work out? It's something in my book I talk about Aaron Sorkin, who wrote The Social Network and a bunch of other films, but he talks about a good story has to have conflict and intent. And this is what this question has. It has conflict and has intent. What did you want to happen versus what actually happened because of all these challenges that stood in the way?
And I wonder, like, so Ira Glass's version of this, as you just said, how did you think the situation was going to work out before it happened, and then how did it really work out? That's kind of a broader.
Yeah.
That so Brandon Stanton's, how does your life turn out differently than you expected it to? The situation there is your life.
Yes.
But Ira Glass broadens it out. It could be any situation, not just your life. Is there any other kind of way to bring up that kind of conflict real quickly like that?
Well, I was gonna say like that. So that I call that a gap question. Like, how did this work out, and how did you think it would work out, and how did it actually work out? You could also get a lot out of the person and their decision making if you dig a little deeper and be like, well, were you worried? What were you doing in that gap? Like, were you worrying about how it was going to turn out? Were you, you were just like, whatever, like, who cares? Like, it tells you a lot about the person's mentality and how they look at problems and how they solve problems. But I think another, to answer your question, another way to ask that could be like, because we're assuming that a person had a vision of something amazing that would have happened and it actually did not work out. But if you were to ask me that question, I would have said, I actually thought my life would be way worse than it turned out. You know what I mean?
I was wondering that when you were saying this, because a lot of this, like, it's almost like when Brandon Stanton's interviewing people, everybody's mildly depressed that things didn't
That's
work out the
true.
way they thought. So, but it is what you just said about, okay, so there's this gap, but then the follow-up questions, how do they deal with that gap? That's where the
Yes.
meat is.
Yes.
So it's like you open the gap, and then that's where you're kind of,
Yeah.
getting the seeds and getting the real meat of the fruit there.
And
So
in the article, I say exploring the gap can give you a window into how the subject feels about their life. Like, do they have regrets about the past, or are they grateful for their present? Are they proud of the choices they made, or do they wish they could have a do-over? So it's like it's introducing regret. Another good question is like, what is something in your life that you regret happened, or that you regret a decision that you made, something like that?
So let me ask you about that, because a lot of people say it's almost like a cliche for people to answer that. Oh, I have no regrets
I know
because
it pisses
otherwise I
me off.
wouldn't. Yeah, and like people do really have regrets.
Of course
So
they do.
okay, yes, if you did this differently in 2012, maybe your babies would be different.
Right.
Like
Right.
since then. So I get that. Like in a science fiction sense, you have no regrets. But really, like, so how do you dig deeper for that? How do you dig deeper for the actual regrets?
I think you set the stage of assuming you would still end up in the same place. Do you have
Mm.
something that you regret that you wish you could do over?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. So you get rid of their objection.
Yes.
Because the one objection is that I don't really want anything right now to change. But
Yeah.
you know, so okay, so number three, and this is a good one, because I always am trying to figure out Joe Rogan, who obviously has the most popular podcast on the planet. And I really enjoy the way he has conversations. And they are interviews, but they don't seem like it. So
Hmm.
number three is a great interviewer mirrors to gather more intel. So maybe describe what that is.
Yeah, I actually think you did it earlier, so we'll have to listen back. But basically, what Joe Rogan and a lot of really, really amazing interviewers do is a technique called mirroring, which is I'll say something and I'll stop, and then the interviewer will take the last phrase of my last sentence and turn it into a question. So the example I gave is somebody went on Joe Rogan's podcast and she said a statistic: 42% of the rising generation have had a mental health diagnosis. And then he said, 42% of kids have a mental health diagnosis. So he's just repeating back her statement as a question, expecting her to elaborate more.
Yeah, and I think that is really valuable, because it shows that that's valuable in a couple different layers. One is, as you point out, that forces them to go beyond the statistic and add more context
Yes.
and information and so on, and maybe tell a story. But it also makes Joe Rogan, in that specific case, the voice of the 10 million listeners, or 50, however,
Yes.
the millions of
Yeah.
listeners, like, because we're all skeptical of it too, or
Yes.
we don't really, it's mind boggling, or how do we understand, make sense of that statistic? And so he becomes the voice of all of his readers, as opposed to being Joe Rogan interviewing somebody.
Yeah. And it, like, you're right. It asks a question out of genuine curiosity, but it also introduces skepticism. Is that true? And they end up looking it up on the show to
Yeah.
see if it was true.
How does he, like, a lot of times he just gets into these just conversations with people, though. Like he'll have like, I saw one recently, like Louis CK was on his show,
Uh-huh.
and they were just talking about the benefits of cold showers, the Wim Hof cold shower,
Yeah.
cold plunges method. And Joe Rogan was saying it was good, and Louis CK is like, I don't really care.
Yeah.
And I guess he sort of trusted Louis CK as an interesting enough guest that they could talk about anything and it'll be interesting content, which is hard to do really for
Yeah.
many podcasts and interviews. Like you just can't let the topics be about anything. But Joe Rogan does it really well.
Yes. And But also, like, right now, the way we're talking, this is how we would be talking even if this wasn't being recorded. But it's also because this is my, I think, third time on your show, so I feel very comfortable with you. If it was my first time, I would be like, well, number 3 says that they explore the
Right.
gap, you know. So
Right.
it's like he's already Louis C.K. is his friend, so it's like almost as if we are listening to a conversation between friends, and that's the magic of it.
I think that's right. And I think like my favorite podcast, I don't know, and I would probably have to say my best podcasts have been where it's a repeat guest.
Yes.
And so I pretty early on I learned the value of having repeat guests, like just continuing the conversation we've always been having. And that is a great technique. And that's what Joe Rogan does. He basically just has his friends on
Yeah.
and they just have a fun time.
Multiple times. Yeah. I mean, he's the king of repeat guests.
And I guess like that's true for Howard Stern as well.
Mhm.
And because because people are listening for them. Like you turn into Joe Rogan, maybe in part for the guest, but also largely because his listeners love him. Howard Stern's
Yeah.
listeners love him. Oprah's listeners love her. Almost doesn't matter
Yeah.
who they're interviewing.
Yeah, and it's also, there's something about the interviewing your friend thing where if you have some sort of relationship or connection or friendship before the interview, the interviewer, it's not as abrasive for them to ask a hard question, you know? Like if somebody says something and they're my friend, I'd be like, come on, that's complete BS. Can you tell the actual story? Like that's not as, versus if I didn't know them and I said that.
Yeah, and I think the goal in an interview, let's say it's a first-time guest, my goal always is to try to get to that point as quickly as
Mhm.
possible in the interview. And sometimes it's not easy. Like it's really hard to kind of get that level of intimacy in a first interview, but I try to get that, but it's difficult.
Yeah, definitely.
With threats to our nation waiting around every corner, adaptability is more important than ever. When conditions change without notice, quick strategic thinking is crucial. And with obstacles consistently impending, determination is essential in overcoming them. It's this willingness, decisiveness, and resilience that sets Marines apart. With our fighting spirit, we don't just fight battles, we win them. Marines are the constant our nation counts on to fight the unknown. And through adaptable problem solving, we do just that. Learn more at marines.com.
Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. With the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms, Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers. In fact, Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcastfree. All lowercase, shopify.com/podcastfree, shopify.com/podcastfree.
Now, number 4 here is, and this is one that is a critical one because I used to be accused of doing this. When I first started my podcast, people would say to me, let your subject talk. And so number 4 you have is a great interviewer masters the art of interruption. The best interviewers know when to interject. And you have a great example. What can you talk about your example?
Yes. So yeah, you have to interject. Otherwise, I personally really hate it when somebody goes on and on and on. And then they make so many points in that really long monologue, but the host hasn't stopped them to explore it. So they just go unexamined. A really good example is Oprah with her Prince Harry and Meghan Markle bombshell interview that everybody tuned in to watch. So Oprah going into this knows that this is going to be watched by millions of people. She's well aware of the pressure. She knows that she can't just let Meghan and Harry talk and say whatever they want. She has to interrupt them and examine every single thing that they say. So at one point, Meghan Markle says something like, well, the palace was really concerned with what color skin my baby would have before he was born. And Oprah just, I don't think Meghan meant, I think it just kind of came out. I don't think she planned to say this. You see her like starting to like fidget in her seat. She gets super uncomfortable. Oprah goes, hold. She like throws her hands up in there, says, hold on. She says, hold up, stop right now. And she goes, there was a conversation with you about how dark your baby is going to be. So she, again, mirrors, says exactly what Meghan Markle said in her last communication, but she does it in this like big showy manner. Now the spotlight is back on Meghan, and Meghan's like, oh, actually, no, it wasn't a conversation with me. It was with Harry. I wasn't there. She says she didn't hear it directly from the source, and she declines to reveal who said it because it may be too damaging. If Oprah hadn't stopped her, people would assume that somebody told Meghan to her face, what color skin will your baby? Like, it's crazy. So it's in that way, as an interviewer, you're almost like you're fact checking on the fly. And that's what Oprah did here. It was really, really well done.
And also, I guess, Meghan, if Oprah hadn't done that, maybe Meghan would have been obsessing in her mind for the rest of the interview, like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
What did I say? Do I have to clarify this? So Oprah gives her a chance to kind of like soften it.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
And that builds a rapport and a relationship. And you give another example with Letterman and Kim Kardashian about her political views. And
so good.
Yeah, like, that's a bigger example. But and you mentioned though that Letterman is an interesting interviewer because he's so quirky. I'm not even quite sure that he is. If it's a style you want to aspire to, because his interviews are very quick and a lot of it is surface. Even is not so much in his Netflix show, or his older Netflix show, but in his main late night show that he did for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
He's really just trying to get laughs from the audience and maybe a tiny spark in the interview. So it's not that intense, but he does, I would say more than interruption, he does like what I would call like a pattern disrupt. It's like he'll do something weird.
Yes. And David Letterman for me is one of the weirdest. Like I have a really hard time watching his interviews because I'm like, he interrupts, I think, too much, but it's part of his thing. And then he'll say something about himself, and I'm like, David, I don't want to know this about you. I want to hear about Kim Kardashian. But that's part of his style. And again, it's very hard to imitate because it's him. It's very much him. And in this example, for the people listening who haven't read the article, he basically sits down with Kim Kardashian. He said he wants to ask her about her political loyalties because she's previously endorsed Hillary Clinton, but then she worked with Donald Trump to get this woman out of prison. So Letterman goes, do you feel like what's being done on behalf of sentencing reform now via this current administration in any way allows the balance of democracy back in a corridor of viability? And Kim Kardashian is like, I have no idea what you just said. He goes, I'll try again. I'm grateful for what you're doing, but it doesn't make me feel better about the current administration. She starts answering, I understand. And he interrupts her very abruptly and goes, let me ask you, who are you voting for? And so like, I think part of his technique, and I don't even know if he does this consciously, he starts out in this very like confusing place. He confuses his interviewee. By the time they figure out what's going on, he just interrupts with a very direct question. And in this way, as the interviewee, you want to answer because you now understand the question.
And I wonder, I don't know if he does that consciously because I think he's a very like smart, intellectual guy. So he might have been wondering,
the corridors of democracy.
Right. Like he might be thinking like, since she liked Hillary Clinton, what is she doing with Trump? So he's thinking of it in this very nuanced political way. Maybe he realizes in the interview that he really just wants to know who she's voting for.
Yes, that could very much be it.
And also he realizes he's I don't want to say he's speaking above her head. I'm sure she's very intelligent also, but maybe he realized he wasn't being so clear. And so then he's smart enough to get as direct as possible.
Yes,
exactly. By the way, why can't she, just because she likes one candidate,
I know,
why can't she do something effective for somebody who's president of the United States, regardless of who they are?
That's how polarized we've become. We cannot have this dichotomy of Kim Kardashian, James.
Right. Like people on both sides, people are willing to break the law to get their candidate in. And it's just ridiculous how polarizing people have been, as opposed to wanting to just do good in society.
Exactly. I agree.
Let's see. Number 5, they make assumptions on purpose. And I think
Yes.
that's a little bit of the gotcha thing as well. But you use the Oprah example again.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be done in a gotcha way. It could be like, here's how I understand it, and then you let the person agree or disagree with you. I think in this one, I wanted to talk about how the interviewer is a representative of their reader or listener or whatever. So Oprah knew that, and she kind of addressed the elephant in the room, which was she knew that the person watching at home is watching this, and Harry is kind of painting himself as the victim of the system. And she's like, oh man, I know what people are thinking. I have to ask it. And so she says, and it's not done in a very confrontational way, just kind of like in a funny way. She says, please explain how you, Prince Harry, raised in a palace in a life of privilege, literally a prince, how you were trapped. And so it's like she makes it, she addresses that, and then and then he responds with, oh, well, it's a system of wealth and all this stuff that you're trapped in, but she doesn't buy his response. So then she makes the assumption. She says, so the impression of the world, maybe it's a false impression, is that all these years before Meghan, you were living your life as a royal, Prince Harry, the beloved Prince Harry, and that you were enjoying that life. We didn't get the impression that you were feeling trapped in that life. So she says, like, here's what we assumed. Is that true or not? And it forces him to take a stance.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because as opposed to the Joe Rogan example where he really becomes the voice of the listener, like, oh, we're all of us 10 million people are skeptical or we want to know more about this thing. She's almost like a translator. Like it's as if there's a gap between she understands there's a gap between what her audience thinks and what Harry is saying. And she's trying to bridge that gap as opposed to just being the voice of the listener. She's trying to translate
exactly
what the listener might be thinking and what Harry might be thinking. So there's an intersection.
Yeah, she keeps giving them the opportunity to explain themselves. And then I watched an interview with her about her interview, and she said, that's all I was trying to do. I was just trying to let them explain their decision. And I think she did a great job.
Yeah, and so Howard Stern, how does he, you mentioned Howard Stern too. I have my own thoughts on his style, but can you talk about the example you give for Howard Stern?
Yeah, so I will admit I was not a big Howard Stern listener until I wrote this, and then a bunch of people told me to go, watch and listen to his interviews. And what I noticed is that I don't know if he thinks that he knows these people or he just like makes assumptions and lets them elaborate. But for example, with Lindsay Lohan, he said a bunch of stuff where he assumed things about how she thinks. And he says, when you see like an Emma Stone or a Jessica Chastain, they got a similar look to you. I can tell you've thought about this. When you see some of those movies, don't you sit there and go, oh, I can effing do those movies. It's got to be driving you nuts. So he claims that he knows how Lindsay Lohan feels. And she's like, yeah, that is exactly what I think.
That's interesting. Like kind of putting yourself on the side of the interviewee, like the person you're interviewing.
Yeah.
And he does that very good. And they go along with it because look, he's a very powerful guy. So yeah, and he's kind of taking their side. So I think with him, he's very interesting because I think he tries to get dirt about everybody during the interview. And at first I noticed in a lot of interviews, people say, no, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
But then by doing this technique, he kind of gets in their head enough and he's on their side and he's not the listener's voice, he's their voice.
Yes.
And finally they're like, oh, I'm talking to myself. So finally they are able to, like I saw him interview Jonah Hill once and he was like, so when you had your first role, did you start like having sex with a lot of girls? Like even though you're kind of fat? And like he's just very direct. And he's like, and Jonah Hill's really uncomfortable. It's like, oh, Howard, I don't want to, I don't want to talk about that. Can we just talk about the movie? But he like, so they talk about the movie, and then he's doing this where he's like on their side of it, but he keeps every now and then he'll ask like the real harsh question, and Jonah Hill will be like, I don't want to. But by the end, Jonah Hill's like listing all the girls he had sex with.
No way.
Yeah, like he just works his way in and he just keeps poking, but then he'll get back to like, oh man, I'm on your side. I'm like,
Yeah.
And I think he combines, he uses this technique that you're talking about to sort of get inside and the person's head, and then finally they're super comfortable, so they forget they're on the radio, and they're yeah.
I watched, I forget which celebrity it was, but they were explaining the experience of why they shared so much on the show. And they were like, it almost feels like you enter this like different thing and there's no cameras, there's nothing. You forget that all this stuff is around you and you're just having a conversation, and then it ends and you're like, what did I just say? It's like that feeling of what just happened. And that's the best interviewers make it seem like time just flies by and you don't even know what's going on.
Yeah, I've heard that too from people who have been on Stern's show, that at first they tell themselves in advance, I am not going to talk about X, Y, and Z. And by the end, they can't figure out how it happened, but they talked about all of those things they didn't want to talk about.
Crazy.
So number 6 here is the great interviewers remove barriers to enhance intimacy. And I love this example of Sean Evans.
Sean Evans, yeah. So usually the obvious example is you remove chairs or you remove tables and things like that in between the interviewer and interviewee to build intimacy quickly. So Oprah will sit on the same couch, like things like that. But it's not just physical objects that you can remove to build intimacy. It's sometimes like Sean Evans with the hot ones, where they eat progressively hotter chicken wings throughout the interview. You're removing like the barrier of like, you're breaking down the guest's composure because everybody comes in like super glam, ready to do this interview. And then by the end, when they're eating a really spicy chicken wing, like they're crying, their nose is running, their throat is burning. A lot of them just can't handle it. And you see like Tyra Banks had a ridiculous reaction on the show. You see their true colors. I included this clip of Sydney Sweeney, but she's really trying so hard to hold on to her composure, and she's like, please, like her voice is shaking, it's super high pitched. It's fascinating to watch.
So what do you do? Like I used to do podcasts in person before COVID, but since COVID, very rare that I do a podcast in person. And you probably interview on the phone or Zoom or whatever. Like, how do you do this technique if there's a lot of like built-in barriers?
Yeah, I mean, it's super hard to do because normally the best interviews, especially the ones like magazine profiles, for example, you're often doing an activity with the person. So whether you're at a restaurant having dinner, you see how they move through the world, how they treat the waiter, how they, all this stuff, context clues that they can't just tell you, I'm a generous person. Well, you didn't even leave a tip, like that kind of thing. But like this is hard because I can tell you how great I am, but unless you see me in my natural habitat, it's hard. I don't know. What do you think? How can you?
I think it's the repeat guest thing is one way. So you're gonna have a hard time that first time, but then it gets easier. I think the pre-interview, like you're on for a little bit and you're just chatting, but I think it's really hard. Or sometimes I'll try to do an activity and then a week later do an interview, but that's rare, so it's hard to do that.
It also one interesting thing, it could be that you found out a really interesting piece of information about the person and you bring it up like in the middle of the interview. It's kind of like a small bomb that goes off where it's like, oh wow, how did you know this? And that breaks down the little like the facade a little bit.
That I try to do. So I try to find like odd things in their background that I could bring up and then connect with things they might be saying now. I don't really have a good example, but like you mentioned before, how like you read or you knew someone did their PhD at your university.
Exactly.
So I might go as far as to read the PhD, the thesis they wrote, and try to find some connection between that thesis and what's going on in their lives right now, and or relate it to something they're doing now in a way that they might not even have thought of. And
Exactly.
so I'll try to kind of like, confuse them with over researching.
Exactly. Exactly. Just like something that's unconventional they're not expecting.
Yeah. Now, this is a really important one. And number 7 here is that a great interviewer strives to capture the juice of the story. And you have
Yeah.
Barbara Walters interviewing Monica Lewinsky, and there's a lot of different angles. It's like it's a president of the United States. It's this
Mhm.
sexual thing, so everybody wants to hear like the sexiest details,
Yeah.
as sordid as it might be. But with this example you give about Monica Lewinsky and Barbara Walters, it really is the juice of the story, like
Yeah.
how she was worried about what her mother would
Mhm.
think. And we can all
Yeah.
relate to that, doing something that's going to be public and like, oh, what are people going to think if they find this out? Like,
Yeah.
and Barbara Walters is really good at that.
Yes, and it's like oh, it's such a good interview for so many reasons, but it's mainly because Barbara Walters knows that she doesn't go the I mean, she asks all the direct newsworthy questions, but what she does is like she gets into Monica's head, and by the end you're like, I get it. I get why she's in love with Bill Clinton. But also at the same time you're like, I cannot believe this happened. It's fascinating. It's like a masterclass in interviewing. And she humanizes Monica to the point where you're like, wow, like, young girl, bad decision making, all this stuff, irresponsible president. But it's like she refers to the juice as the details of the story that humanize the person that you're interviewing. And Barbara says, don't be so intent on getting just the facts that you take out all the juice.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she kind of layers into this. So,
Yeah.
like, like Lewinsky says, I felt very responsible, and
Mm,
Barbara Walters says, responsible for what? And
exactly.
and by the way, there's a nuance there because she didn't say why do you feel responsible. That
Yeah.
would have taken it in a completely different direction. Lewinsky said, "Well, I agreed to go into his office, blah blah blah."
Uh-huh.
Instead, she says responsible for what, and that led to the
Yeah.
discussion of her mother. But then that allows her to get enough intimacy with Monica that she says, "Monica, are you still in love with Bill Clinton?"
Right.
And she uses Monica's name. She says Monica. She doesn't say, "Are you still in love with Bill Clinton?" So
Yes.
it's more personal when she uses the name. And if she had started off with, "Are you still in love with Bill Clinton?" I think that would have been a different
Yeah.
answer, different interview then.
Yeah. The whole interview like builds on itself. It's fascinating to watch.
I think that's really hard. I think, and as you mentioned later, the only way to get that skill is doing lots of interviews.
Yeah. It's true. And it's like you notice so many things as you're watching it. Like at one point, Monica Lewinsky, I didn't include this, but in the interview, she says, at one point, my mom, like, I couldn't shower alone. My mom would sit in the bathroom with me while I showered because they were all afraid that I might do something. She's obviously talking about, like, might take her own life. But Barbara Walters is very skilled at like knowing when to dig deeper and knowing when to kind of back off. And she says this in another interview. Barbara Walters says this. She's like, you know, for the really really painful stuff, I'm not gonna keep digging until I break you. Basically, I'm gonna like get there and then back off. And that's a skill, and that's like a social awareness skill that not everybody has.
And also knowing that she could go back to it later. Like
Yeah,
she's patient, Barbara
yeah,
Walters. And again, she's almost become a cliche interviewer. I mean, not her, but like just the
yeah.
way people think about her. But I think people underestimate her full power as an interviewer, Barbara Walters.
Totally. Totally.
I mean, because then later on she's doing stuff like The View and all that. But
Yeah.
like you give an example in the next thing,
Yes.
challenging a subject's perspective with genuine curiosity. She interviewed the Shah of Iran,
Yeah.
right before he's getting overthrown. Like she was like the biggest interviewer on the planet at that
I
point.
know. I know. And it's interesting, a lot of times she became friends. I think that was kind of like, wait a second. She became friends with the people that she interviewed. She became friends with Monica Lewinsky. And I believe the Shah of Iran. But it's interesting because like I do think like a really in-depth human interview has no choice but to leave the people like, oh, we know each other on a different level, you know?
Yeah, I think when you really are able to go a couple layers deep, And then, she was trying to ask him and talk to him about his views on women
Yeah.
and, coming from a Muslim country and so on.
In
And
1977.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, which was, on the one hand, I don't know how completely we treat women differently now, but at least
Yeah.
at that point in the 70s was the height of the, Gloria Steinem's original feminism movement, and things like the Equal Rights Amendment were being discussed, and so it was a different conversation, but it was still a big conversation in America, maybe for the first time. And
Yeah.
I don't know, it might have actually been, then a year later he's overthrown, and the US really didn't help him, and we got left with what we have now, this kind of, religious, super religious government in Iran that most of the people don't like. Most of the people wanted the Shah of Iran in Iran. And now most, 80 million people in Iran are secular, and they're ruled by this super
Interesting.
religious
I did not
establishment.
know any of this. Okay.
Oh yeah, like Iran does not like their government. Like the people there, and that's why they literally beg the outside world to understand this, because they don't want to get bombed if their government does something. Like they
That's
prefer
fascinating.
not to be. They were a completely Western country under the Shah, almost, not completely, but almost. And now they're not. But they don't want.
Interesting.
They want people to know that, so that they don't get blamed if like Iran bombs Israel. They don't want to get bombed back because they're not like their government.
I'm gonna do some research after this.
Yeah, and I think that was a mistake for Jimmy Carter at the time to not help the Shah a little more, because we didn't like some of the things he did, but that's like every country in the world. We don't like most of the things the French do either, but we're still their ally.
Oh, that's fascinating. There's so many layers here.
Yeah, and Barbara Walters is, I think she understood that, like, he's a dictator, but he was still kind of our friend. And then you don't condone everything your friends do, obviously, and particularly at that geopolitical level. But he was certainly much better than what happened.
Yeah.
Number 9 is they know all humans seek genuine validation, and this is really important too.
Yeah, this I found fascinating because Oprah talks about how pretty much every person that she's interviewed, including George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Beyonce, anybody she's interviewed, after the interview ends, they always ask her, I bet you get this question too. They're like, ooh, was that good? Was that okay? And it's like, and she's like, what do you mean? You're Beyonce. Of course it was okay. But like everybody has that small piece of them that's like, did you like what I said? And do you think this will resonate with people? And I think a great interviewer's job is to make the person feel validated and actually listened to during the interview.
Yeah, and I think this happens at every level. Like, so for many years I did stand-up comedy, and then I owned part of a stand-up comedy club. So I would see all these great comedians perform on stage. They'd be trying out material for their special or whatever. And no matter how famous the comedian was, like they always ask that too. Like, was that okay? Was that good? Do you think the audience liked me? And people are human. They want to know. They want to be liked.
Exactly. I thought that was really I was like, I would have never thought, but yeah, I do it too. It's crazy.
Have you interviewed any like hardcore criminals?
Oh my God. No, I don't think so.
Like
Interviewed criminals.
Like anybody who's gone to jail?
Yes, I interviewed oh my gosh. The guy who Leonardo DiCaprio played in Catch Me If You Can.
Oh yeah, Frank Abagnale. I interviewed him as well.
Yeah, exactly. So fascinating. He was a big criminal, but then he worked for the FBI, so I don't know if that counts.
Yeah. No, and a lot of times, I interviewed someone recently who committed a fairly big fraud, like $400 million Ponzi scheme, and he went to jail for 9 years.
Wow.
And I think it was very important for me interviewing him that I didn't treat him like someone who did something really bad. But I still wanted to make sure my listeners knew that it was clear this person did something bad and I was against it. So it sometimes is a tricky thing.
Yeah. Because you're trying to be empathetic, but there has to be a clear line of like, this is, I mean, we can all agree that what you did was not right.
It was tricky too. Like I interviewed Andrew Tate,
Oh,
and
okay.
and Andrew Tate,
Oh man.
obviously, yeah, that's a whole mess. If you're trying to be liked by everybody, don't interview Andrew Tate because nobody will.
Right.
Everybody's going to make a judgment. Oh, you must agree with everything he
Right.
says, or you must like him, or he used you, or whatever. And so sometimes the interviewer has to balance all of these things too.
Yeah, it's so hard. It's like, these people's views would never go challenged if I didn't interview them. You know what I mean? Like for anybody interviewing a dictator, are you just quote unquote giving them a platform, or are you interviewing them and challenging what they think so that more people can like hear that it's BS? I don't know. It's really difficult.
Like, let's say you had to interview Putin.
Okay.
So now, so there's so many layers in which you could
I'm from Bulgaria. He's from Russia. This will be a tough one, James.
Right. Like, so your family they might say, don't talk to him or whatever. And then people might think will make a judgment about whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
Right.
Oh, only Republicans would talk to Putin. But obviously he would be a fascinating person to interview. I mean, he's on, he's a leader of Russia. He's conducting a war. Whether you agree with that war or not, no matter what he did, I would interview him.
Yeah. Well, it's so tricky. It's like the whole point of journalism in general is to interview people who are doing things that are newsworthy, that are affecting the world, all this stuff. By ignoring someone doesn't make them go away. In fact, It actually fuels them more. I don't know. There's a whole philosophical discussion on this.
Yeah, it gets back to the thing of you have to join a team and then only talk to the people that team approves.
Exactly. And it's like, I'm on nobody's team. I just want to hear the information and then challenge that information.
Yeah, like I was once on the podcast talking to Mehdi Hassan, who had this show on MSNBC.
Yes, there's a profile on him right now.
Oh yeah, I have seen that. And I told him I'm neutral. I really try very hard to be neutral so I could talk to everybody and not feel biased. And he said there's no way to be neutral. He challenged me on that, and we were going to follow up at some point, and he was going to prove to me that I wasn't neutral. And maybe I'm not, I don't know, but
that's the thing. I mean, I guess nobody's truly neutral, but I also, completely reject the idea that you're either a Republican or a liberal. Like I don't fall into any category. It's like really hard. Maybe you're not neutral. You're just like not part of any one group.
Yeah, where you have to like do everything that group says.
Yeah, exactly.
But then I wonder, look, the podcasts that are the most popular take a stance and are really biased.
That's true.
I'm just not like that.
Yeah, that's not your style.
And the good thing with what you do is that you could profile anybody. Yeah. So you're trying to take lessons from them, and so you could choose. They don't. You seldom will profile like a political person.
That's the thing. Like, I truly believe that you can learn from awful people about what not to do. Like there's lessons in everybody. It's not just like the good, moral, whatever people that we put on these like pedestals. It's also the people like, oh my God, look at how their life turned out. I don't want that at all.
Yeah, like who would you say is like the worst person in the world right now? Would you interview that person?
Oh my God, I don't even know. It's also like, nobody is like only evil or only good, but there are some pretty bizarre.
Yeah, some people are insane, so like they are mentally ill and bad. But like,
okay, for example, here's an example. So right now I'm working on an article that's similar to this interviewing techniques, but it's on public speaking. And I'm, on Twitter, I asked, who is the greatest public speaker of all time? And of course, people came up with Hitler, Mussolini, a bunch of cult leaders, a bunch of other dictators. And I'm like, I get it. But in my article right now, I'm saying like, I understand that these people are probably amazing public speakers, I'm not going to include them just because I do not want to like feature their stories. But the world's greatest speakers all use similar techniques. That's not to say they did or did not use this. It's just I'm choosing, my editorial style is choosing not to include dictators and cult leaders in this article.
But it's really interesting because, like, you're right. They all use similar techniques, and that's going to be a fascinating article when you write it. And I've written a lot about public speaking as well, because it is another thing like interviewing where you're trying to win over, just like in an interview, you're trying to win over an audience, and there are specific techniques to do it, and you have to be as genuine and sincere as possible as well. But like a dictator will, for instance, a dictator uses Robert Cialdini's consistency technique. Yeah, like they'll use all his techniques. Like, someone like Hitler might say something like, wasn't your life awful before? And when bread was like a gazillion marks, and people would say yes. And then when I became leader, wasn't your life better? And then it's a bigger yes. So it's like that consistency, like getting them to say a small yes to get them to a bigger yes. He was very effective at doing things like that.
Right.
And cult leaders are like that as well.
Exactly. And it's just like up to the person. Like, maybe you really don't like me. I am not entitled to be on your show. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, I think that every person has like a freedom to have whoever they want on their platform. And if they want to interview Putin and ask him questions, it's their right. Like you will not catch me not defending free speech.
Yeah, good. Good thing. And look, let's see. And you say here, the only way to become a masterful interviewer is to interview. Larry King conducted more than 60,000 interviews in his career. Oprah has done more than 37,000. Joe Rogan has hosted more than 21 guests on his podcast. It's really true. You've got to do things.
Yeah. And it's like, once you think about 60,000 interviews, that is so many, or 37,000. And then people think about Joe Rogan, he has the biggest show, biggest podcast, but he's only done 2,100 recorded interviews on his show. So it's like, and you've done 1,500. So it's like, those are big numbers, but 60,000 is like a different universe.
Yeah. And, and again, like he does, like Larry King, those specifically are interviews, and Joe Rogan, it still feels so much like conversations. And I really almost aspire to that. But you have to use interview techniques. Like, these are all really important techniques. But, one thing I'm going to try at one point is just give everybody, like, go on Twitter, give everybody the Zoom link, and interview whoever just comes on.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, just to show that everybody's got a story. And of course, Brandon Stanton and Humans of New York does that really well. But
that's the thing. Sorry, what I say is like, you don't have to have a podcast to do an interview or have a conversation. It's just like with any stranger, you can practice these skills and just become a better conversationalist.
Yeah, and like, what do you think though? On TikTok or Instagram, I see all these guys who go up to people and say, "Hey, how much rent do you pay?" And they say, "Oh, $15,000 a month in New York City. Can I get a tour of your apartment?" And they give the tour. And like, so what do you think of that style, where it's like there's one question, and then they ask everybody, and then the interview is around that?
I kind of like that. It's because it has an angle. So, it's kind of like Hot Ones. The angle is, I'm going to ask you these random questions while you eat spicy food. It's the same. It's like, it has a slight point of view, so you know exactly what you're getting, but then it can go anywhere.
Yeah, and there's this voyeurism aspect.
Yeah.
So it's like, can you show me
And
something?
It's the intimacy. It's like the most intimate thing you can show somebody is your home.
Right, and the guy... The main guy I'm thinking of who does this, I mean, maybe there's more than one, but the main guy I'm thinking who I always see who does this, he always says, "Can I sit in your bed?"
Oh my God, I have not seen that.
Yeah, and it's usually like some really beautiful woman who he goes up to and says, "Hey, how much do you like?" It usually starts there, so
Huh.
he's getting every voyeuristic aspect, and you kind of are left wondering, like, is he going to have sex with this girl? Like,
Oh my God.
it's the kind of interview sort of is in that direction. But
Uh-huh.
I kind of like there's the what do you do for a living guy? Like, I like that guy too.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to just like quickly build intimacy with someone in a way that's like, can I see your house? How much money do you make? What do you do for a living? Like all the things that people think make them who they are.
And I guess it is also the consistency thing. Like if you answer, like obviously we don't see all the rejections these people do. They only
Yeah.
show us the Instagram reels of the people who answer. But if you're already answering, what do you do for a living, or how much money do you make, or what's your rent, you've already
Yeah.
said something so personal that now it's wide
Yeah.
open for the guy to ask anything.
Yeah, but I also think those people probably have pre-interviewed these people to get there. I don't think anybody's like, oh, well, we happen to be on the block where my apartment is. Let's go check it out.
I wonder, or if we just happen, or if like 9 times out of 10 he gets nothing, and then just
Maybe.
one time out of 100 maybe he gets lucky and the person pays $200,000 a month in rent, and we can see their apartment.
You should have him on.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. Jay,
Yeah.
who's listening to this, let's get that guy on. I want to figure out, because that's a little bit like what I used to do at this 3 a.m. idea I used to do for
Yeah.
HBO in the 90s, which is, why are you out at 3 in the morning? It was that kind of concept. And I always think I did the first podcast because I would put it on the internet, these interviews that I
That's crazy.
was given permission to do. So,
That's cool.
but Polina Pompliano,
Thank you, James.
such a great newsletter, The Profile. I love all of your newsletter. Every episode edition that comes out, I'm always a reader. You always have at least one reader, which is me, as soon as you send it out. And you also wrote the book Hidden Genius about some of your more interesting profiles. And always great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And congratulations. I don't know if you said congratulations on second baby.
Thank you so much. A lot going on these days.
Yeah. Like how many editions do you put out a week?
One every Sunday, and then sometimes one every Wednesday.
Okay. Yeah. I know
Yeah.
I've seen more than one a week from you. And, and are you going to keep like this? Is this it now for life? Like you're going to just do this newsletter for life? You're making money and it's all good?
Well, I really love the newsletter. I have no reason to not do it. But I really enjoy it. I've done it for the last 7 years, every single week. But now my goal is to do more interviews. So if anybody listening needs, moderating help or is hosting something where they need an interviewer, let me know.
Very good call to action there. So,
Thank you.
and thanks so much, Polina, again. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. With the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms, Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers. In fact, Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcastfree. All lowercase, shopify.com/podcastfree, shopify.com/podcastfree.